All cells, whether they are prokaryotic or eukaryotic, have a semi-permeable plasma membrane that serves to keep cellular material inside the cell and extracellular material outside of the cell. In a separate video, I will discuss how materials cross the plasma membrane. In this video, I will discuss the main components of the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane is a structure that serves to separate the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. Here we can see that the extra side of the cellular membrane is up and the cytoplasmic side of the cellular membrane is down, and you can see that there are different components on the inside versus the outside of the cell. The plasma membrane consists mostly of a phospholipid bilayer, but it also contains other biological macromolecules, such as cholesterol, seen here in between the phospholipids, carbohydrates attached either to the phospholipids or to proteins, as well as large proteins, both transmembrane or integral proteins, as well as peripheral proteins. I will discuss the function of each of these components individually. The plasma membrane is composed mainly of phospholipids. The structure of phospholipids consists of a hydrophilic head group that contains a phosphor group, as well as two hydrophobic fatty acid tails. This difference in charge across the structure helps with the orientation when forming the plasma membrane. Phospholipids are oriented so that the hydrophilic heads interact with the inside of the cell and the cytoplasm, as well as the outside of the cell and the interstitial fluid surrounding each of the cells. Now, in the center of the membrane are the hydrophobic tails, which form a hydrophobic core. This orientation of the phospholipid heads with the hydrophilic portions on the inside and the outside and the hydrophobic core helps form the semipermeable membrane. The other lipid component of the plasma membrane is cholesterol. Cholesterol differs in structure from phospholipids, but both phospholipids and cholesterol are considered part of the lipid family because they share the hydrophobic properties. Cholesterol's presence in the membrane is found on both sides of the phospholipid bilayer, as we can see here, in between the phospholipids themselves. The function of the cholesterol in the membrane is to provide structural rigidity. Cholesterol's presence prevents the side-to-side movement of the phospholipids, making the membrane more stable. The next biological macromolecule that's present in the plasma membrane is proteins. Proteins that span the entire plasma membrane are called integral proteins. Structurally, these proteins have hydrophilic portions that interact with the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell, and they also have hydrophobic portions that interact with the hydrophobic core made by the hydrophobic tails of the phospholipids themselves. Integral proteins within the plasma membrane have many different functions, including transport. In a different video, we'll talk about integral proteins that serve as both channels and carrier molecules to move molecules across the plasma membrane. Since these proteins span the plasma membrane, they're also capable of acting as signal transduction molecules, where they can bind to signals on the extracellular side and move that message inside the cell from the intracellular side. Integral proteins also act as attachment points to the extracellular matrix on the outside, as well as the cytoskeletal elements on the inside. They can have enzymatic activity, as we can see here. They can also be responsible for joining two cells together, as in this picture. And lastly, they can aid in cell-cell recognition through the interactions of the carbohydrate groups that are attached to these proteins, which we'll talk about again in a minute. Proteins that are anchored to either the inside or the outside of the cell are called peripheral proteins. In this picture, we see that the peripheral proteins are anchored to the plasma membrane through lipid tails that are interacting with the phospholipid bilayer themselves. Because these proteins are found either on the inside or the outside of the plasma membrane, they often serve as signaling molecules. The last component of the plasma membrane are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates can be attached to either proteins, where they are referred to as glycoproteins, or they can be attached to lipids, where they are referred to as glycolipids. Independent of how and where they are attached, the carbohydrates serve as a self-cell recognition function, where they allow the immune system to identify the cell as belonging to the host themselves. This then allows the immune system to easily identify cells that are infected or are foreign. And that ends the video on the components of the plasma membrane.